talk about all things Dynamo today, based in Boston, and currently pretty stormy here in Boston over the summer. So hot and wet. Dana?
Hey guys, thanks for having me today. I am Dana De Filippi and I am based out of DC. Well, the office is in DC. I actually just moved out of DC during COVID into Virginia, about an hour south. And it's nice and sunny here, a little overcast, but it's looking pretty bright in my room, right?
So welcome, Dana.
Thank you.
All right. Rules. There's rules. We'll get to the legal disclaimers and rules, but lines are muted to reduce our background noise. We invite you to turn your camera on so we kind of get a sense of who all is it in the community conversation with us, so we feel like we're all together. If you have a question, either raise your hand and we'll call on you to unmute, or you can use the chat in Zoom. And we have a pretty good crew here today that are fast on that. The session is being recorded and a link will be emailed to you after the end of it. So if you have friends, colleagues that would like to watch it later and couldn't make it, feel free to send them that link. Or if you just want to watch us talk again, or Jacob said something funny or something informative.
Maybe both.
It could be both, yes. This is the fun one from the lawyers. This is, don't make any purchase decisions about Autodesk products based on any forward-looking statements. If Jacob says that we're now going to have a furry graph feature coming up in the future, do not make your decisions on Dynamo based on that forward-looking statement, however crazy it may be. So it is as the product is today. The community conversations provide opportunities for engineers, designers, artists, and makers to meet in a safe, live virtual setting, to share expertise and get to know leaders in your field and grow your community network. So this is a community conversation. Let's keep it like that, get to know some of the people in here. These sessions are always supported by Autodesk community managers to help guide the conversation, feed important insights back from the community to Autodesk, and to support participants in getting connected to the expertise you need. You could also host your own. So, we'll provide a link that you could do them yourself if you're interested in leading one. This is for everybody. This is not just Autodesk. This is people out in our community. All right, let it roll.
All right, thank you, Sean. So
what's on the
everybody.
menu?
Dinner with friends or diner with friends, depending on your local persuasion. You can read this whatever way you wish. But basically, the notion of today is that we're going to talk about sharing, about creating things and giving them to other people and working collaboratively together with a little focus on Dynamo Player as well. So as per usual, we're typically going to go through around about a 20-minute presentation. We're going to have Dana present with us today. So welcome, Dana. Thank you for joining. There's going to be a live demonstration this time inside the presentation, around about halfway through. And then there's going to be a Q&A session at the end. But also, as per usual, if you want to talk and ask salient questions halfway through the session, please do. And we'll endeavor to engage with you on the fly. This is a conversation after all. And we'd love to have a back and forth with you all.
Cool. So I wanted to start stuff off by just sort of getting into things you might want to consider when organizing and naming your graph libraries, right? Because users really, they're not going to use what they can't readily find. If it's there, but nobody can access it or can't find it in the mess of stuff you've got, they're not going to make use of it. So your content shouldn't require any kind of Rosetta Stone or a significant amount of institutional knowledge just in order to figure out what graph it is that I'm after. Try and keep your language as simple and straightforward as possible, right? This is really, really helpful for archaeologists, not so much for AEC companies, right? Keep it as simple and user-focused as possible. Also really helps to maintain a very simple naming standard for not just your graphs, but also your folders. The easier it is going to be able to find that content, again, the more people are going to be able to leverage it. You may also want to consider setting up different folders for typical user profiles, i.e. a different set of graphs for your MEP users who might care more about lighting layouts or ductwork layouts or working with spaces versus you have for your architects or interiors people or whatever else you may have, right? Different people have different needs, similar to how you have your Revit toolbars set up for different sort of use groups. That really carries over into your Dynamo graphs as well. Next up, keep your documentation handy and in the same sort of location as you have your other graphs, right? So if I do some digging around and I find the actual area where my graphs are, it might help if there was a subfolder with any help content I might need in there to just sort of walk through what I might need to know beyond what's readily apparent when I go to leverage those graphs. And then last but not least, your production library is not where you want to do your actual work, right? Keep the library for your authoring and what you produce as you go separate, and then a simple, clean user-facing library for people to actually utilize as they go through. That'll keep everything, again, clean and easy for those users to get what they're after, as opposed to working with something that might not quite be ready for production. All right, next up, want to talk a bit about versioning. Which saved as option, right? As we know, as we build through graphs here, I mean, you can see I've got it there, Shapefinder 0.1, Shapefinder 0.2, all the way up to Shapefinder 1.2. The way you save and label your graphs really will help users make sure they're working with the right content, right? And because what works in 17 may not work in 18 or 19 or 20 or 2039, whatever Revit version we want to talk about, you really have to be careful about clearly communicating what version they should be working with. So keeping that naming standard really helps. I do recommend checking out semantic versioning. You can find that at semver.org, which has this great sort of simple explanation in terms of how your major, minor, and patch numbers work out. That can, again, apply to your Dynamo graphs. I also do recommend sort of managing the content the same way you do your Revit families, as in one library of Dynamo content for every Revit release or Civil 3D release, because the capabilities of Dynamo do change as your host integration changes as well. You should also plan to upgrade your Dynamo library when you upgrade your other tools, right? And then try to avoid multi-year release cycles whenever possible. If you've got a great graph that sort of works out for, I don't know, calculating the maximum egress capacity from a room, and that changes halfway through the year, the person who goes to use it again on that same project, it might behave differently, which is just going to lead to confusion. So try to keep that to sort of a consistent cycle and make sure you communicate those as you go. Also try and have a sort of test file ready to go with each graph so you can quickly confirm functionality. This is a huge thing. A lot of people, when they're doing their initial production, they build up that test file, they find out how it works and like, hey, this works great. We can hand it off and go, but then they forget about that test file. Maintain that test file, because the next year, if you want to make sure that graph works, the easiest way, just going to run it on that same test file, as opposed to having to rebuild a brand new data set. And then also marshal all your other associated content at the same time. So don't just assume that the Excel that you used in Revit 2018 is valid for Revit 2019 or 2020 or so on and so forth. Push all those associated pieces together along all at once. And that'll just keep things running smoother for your end users.
Yeah, and one other thing to add is semantic versioning is also how Dynamo is versioned, if you'll notice. So we have major versions such as Dynamo 1.0 or 2.0, and we have minor versions, as in this case, Dynamo 2.12, which we just released. And then the minor versions beyond that, or sorry, the patch versions are things that come in for either security patches or bug fixes that are salient enough to push out in a very small patch. We also have a third, or sorry, fourth number if you're looking at the daily builds as well, which is basically a build number, but that doesn't really matter, doesn't really make a difference.
I need a test file for each of my graphs. That's brilliant. Maybe a super file that I can test every single one.
Yeah, that's actually it's really handy if you can build one data set that would test all of a group of graphs. So back when I was still in practice, I had something for documenting clearances at different pieces of equipment, one for stairs, one for doors, one for ramps, one for, I don't know, window or something else like that. There was a fourth one, I can't remember what it was, but I had one file that had sort of edge cases that I found for those different pieces. And then I could just, every year at the upgrade, just run another, run the graphs on those four, and then, hey, it's great. And that was actually worse because that was back when Dynamo was updating out of sync with the Revit product line. So you were just testing constantly, which was good and bad for many reasons, but conversation perhaps for another day.
With that being said, I wonder, just for the sake of the intuitivity of your user, of whether you should use the versioning. I know obviously you're versioning it to Dynamo, but whether you should associate it to Revit versions instead, just so that it's a little bit clearer?
Yeah. Honestly, if I had the option to do it over again the way I was before, I probably would start with sort of the 2-digit year. That way people would just sort of know what it worked out to. And we'll talk a little bit about this in one of the coming slides, but it also would allow us to sort of know which year was this packed for, because there are changes between years that you're not going to find until you go to do that upgrade. And sometimes you want to go back and make the change in the previous version. So you have one version of that Dynamo. It might be saved as in a new location. Other times, yeah, go ahead and branch off and split for something new. But it definitely helps to try and keep that stuff organized within the year, the file name, or the product year, I should say.
And one final thought on tests is we actually do this on the team as well. We have tests for every single node that we build that we need to make sure run and behave in exactly the same way between builds as well. And when things go wrong, we have to go and investigate why and figure out what kind of interaction that node is now having with some other piece of content that has changed in Dynamo as we build it, to make sure that it still executes and behaves correctly for you when you want to use it at the end of the day. So tests are awesome. Definitely would pile on that one and say that it's really, really useful to have a consistent baseline to understand if your content is just behaving the same way.
Cool. All right, next up, there's two basic types of graphs. You've got your design graphs and your automation graphs. And the particular use is going to drive the application of your particular technology. So as we talked about a couple times now, there is element binding. It's a thing that's out there. You can go back and review. I believe John Pearson was on that section when we mentioned it a few weeks back. I don't know. The days are blending into weeks or blending into months at this point. So my timeline may be off. Just go watch the whole series. But yeah, you can go back and clear out those bindings in some cases when it makes sense to, such as your automation graphs. If you've got something that's going to make levels on every single time, given an Excel spreadsheet that's unique to the project, you don't need element binding for that. You're going to make that constantly. Same thing for work sets, same thing for other stuff. But if you're doing something that's based off of the geometry in another piece to lay out framing or adaptive component paneling on the side of your building, that's a little bit more specific, and that's probably going to be very finely tuned to that particular project. And you probably want to leverage bindings to do those updates over time, as opposed to having to go back and, well, just delete everything we had before, run the graph again, and then we can redo all the marks and material changes that we've done throughout. No, keep that stuff there and let element binding do its job. So towards that end, you might want to consider two separate collections of graphs. One for your automation piece, that's going to be leveraged primarily through Dynamo Player, and one for sort of project-specific stuff. So your automation piece, it's going to live on a commonly accessible location, either on a network or consistently pushed to one location on the user's local disk. And for your project-specific stuff, it's going to live specifically with your other project data, the same way you might save out your custom families that you may have built up for the project. Now, remember the impact of binding, the bindings have impact in the long and the short term, right? And if you sort of think the consequences and skew one end or the other, you may decide to not work with bindings early on and find that you want it after the fact. It's always easy to remove the bindings, but if you start without the capability to leverage those bindings, you're never going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle, right? So keep that in mind as you go. Last but not least, project graphs don't necessarily scale as well job to job, but they will save you tons of time if you leverage them correctly. So don't forget about that. Now, it does require somebody directly on the project team having a good amount of Dynamo experience, but that's why we're all here today, right? Anything from you guys?
Nope, that's pretty well covered, I think.
Cool. All right, scalability between versions. Basically, when we're building up our libraries, we want to plan for reuse. So if you find a problem on an upgrade, try to fix it in the prior version and subsequent versions as well. And this is one particular example. You see, if we got a Dynamo graph up there, it is the simplest graph ever. It's just a drop down that says room for the categories that's set to rooms right now, and it's going to pull all elements of category. Blown up looks something like that, right? Very, very simple two-node graph. Now I went and opened this instead of in Revit 2019, which is what I built this in. I went and I opened that same graph in Revit 2022. And oddly enough, this is how it opened up. It no longer says rooms. It's now saying point clouds. Those things are not the same. They have nothing to do with each other likely, and we really don't want that to happen. So what do? Well, instead, hard code that category by using the name. Use a category by name, call out the category that you're looking for, rooms, category by name node, and it's going to get you that same data in the end. Now, this is no longer an issue for this particular piece in the newer versions of Dynamo. I believe it was fixed. So if you started a graph in Dynamo for Revit 2020, that issue is resolved. It might be 2021. I'm not entirely sure on that. But once that happens, you don't have to worry about that long time. But this is an example where I would probably go back and issue a patch, a minor patch version to the previous graph and swap that category dropdown out for that other node and just keep it consistent throughout all those Revit versions, and then you don't have to worry about it. Also, you want to assume your file-specific content is never consistent. Plan on empty dropdowns in those cases. So if it's a select model element, if it's, select the family from the dropdown, that kind of content, just assume that whatever you think they might have in there, it's not necessarily going to be there. You can always apply filters as needed after the fact, or pop up sort of informational messages to the end users to let them know what's going on if they did pick out something that doesn't work. Your integration release specific content is mostly going to be static year to year. So again, that's those dropdowns. Don't worry about that quite as much, but you always want to make sure that's one of those things that you're verifying. Lastly, when possible, hard code everything that you can. You don't want users to sort of go off the rails. And if it's typed up in not even a string node, but in a code block, it's going to be much harder for them to manipulate that if they're leveraging primarily Dynamo Player. And then a good piece of advice, follow the Dynamo blog to learn of new features before they hit and you have to quickly bulk change a whole bunch of stuff. I know we just had a great post on Dynamo 2.12, which has come out. That's not in any of the integrations just yet, but by understanding what changes are coming, you can start to plan on those changes in advance and prep yourself for when there's inevitable, we've got to push everything through quite quickly. Yes, we can get you a post for the Dynamo BIM blog, Michelle.
So Dana, do you want to say something? I've got a comment as well if you don't.
Oh, I was waiting for your comment. I will say the drop-down converter through the Monocle package that John puts out is really wonderful as well. It will convert your drop-down in particular category to a design script code block. So that's really, really nice. But I've just gotten into the habit of hardwiring it rather than using the drop-downs in my own scripts, unless it's an input for Dynamo Player, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, and one other way to conceptually think about it is, like Jacob mentioned, there's kind of like design graphs and automation graphs. Anything that is supposed to repeat itself again and again, such as an automation graph, should be as hard-coded as possible. So that's when you have figured out the recipe for what you want to solve, and you're just going to execute that thing again and again. So you can think of this as like QA, QC scripts, or things that are going to go and clean out your Revit file before you want to deliver it to somebody. So actions that are going to happen and repeat themselves again and again. For scripts that are more design-focused, we would still encourage definitely the usage of dropdowns, because then you want the user to start choosing the actions that they take in those instances.
Cool. All right, thanks, guys. On to the next slide, deployment. So users aren't going to use what they can't access, right? So a few things here. One, I think content should always be celebrated. So anytime you're going to be pushing stuff out, have a show and tell, write up a blog post for your internal intranet blog, send out a blast email, show it off in the Dynamo forum, or even tweet about it. I love sort of seeing that stuff publicized when people are pushing that stuff out. It's a great feeling to me and a lot of other members of the community. When it comes time to actually push that stuff out, you want to work with IT to keep things in the right place with permissions controlled for read-only access for anything that's Dynamo Player specific. That way you don't have to worry about bindings accidentally getting added into the file by someone hitting that edit button at some point. Also, don't forget about your package library. The graph library should follow the package library in terms of deployment. If the packages aren't there, you're effectively giving them a car, but not handing them the keys. Right? You can't actually leverage that content if the packages that are in use haven't been pre-deployed. Last but not least, when it comes time for the actual push and deployment, test before, roll out in a small group, have that small group test, and then scale it out to the rest of the users. So a lot of times I work with offices that have these design technology departments. I would recommend the main Dynamo author. do that initial testing, make sure things are feeling good, have a couple other people on the design technology team test it to confirm, and then finally push it out to all the users all at once. When that push does happen, plan for an all hands on deck, because even in software terms, right, they say never push to production on Friday because it means you will be working on the weekend. It's the same thing in AEC technology, right? When it happens, things, if they go wrong, they're going to go wrong when it pushes production, never on a Friday. Exactly. And then you've got people on hand who can take the time to clear this stuff up. Question from Jason. Are there anything documented for doing these deployments, best practices for deployments? Not really. Every individual office sort of has their own required IT standards for how they manage their deployments. It's different from how you might deploy other software, but it's not really any different from how you might deploy, let's say, CAD block updates or Revit template updates or anything else, right? So getting the content to the right set of users is sort of the big first key step. All right, anything from you, Sol, Dana? No?
Just a comment to say that we're going to talk a little bit about some other pieces related to your question, Jason, as time goes on in these presentation pages. Cool. So I'm going to take it over from Jacob for a little while and talk about a few different things. And the first one being network drives. So these are great on paper, not necessarily so great in practice. So you may want to have different strategies, and we'll cover one or two in the next slides about how to get around this. But basically, there's two primary concerns when it comes to network drives. If you have them working in your office and it works for you, great, like awesome, all credit to you, and please keep doing so. But there are some problems that can arise, and these come from predominantly Windows security issues as opposed to anything that Dynamo is dealing with. So first of all, usually there's not trusted locations. So things such as binaries or DLL files that ship with Dynamo or ship with Zero Touch packages won't load without additional IT effort. There's basically security controls that is going to stop the content coming to you and coming into your Dynamo session. And then also, if the network drive is large, then the default Windows system access libraries, the way that Windows actually accesses things, are very, 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 very slow. Meaning it can actually take minutes to look for a package, even if that package is infinitesimally small. Next slide, please. Cool. So now that we have this little warning out of the way, we're going to start talking a little bit about Dynamo Player. And Dana's going to jump onto this bandwagon and get quite in depth with some tips and tricks and some good content shortly. But basically, you can think about the whole Dynamo ecosystem as you see on the image graphic to your right, which is Dynamo is actually made up of these sort of thematics, a creation thematic, a consumption thematic, and an execution thematic. And so as far as the creation thematic goes, this is the UI you have in Dynamo, the window where you execute your node wire diagram, you create content through this, you have the ability to sort of investigate the background preview. And then when you've created all of this kind of content and you hit the run button, it runs to the execution piece of the puzzle. So that is Dynamo's virtual machine. In theory, Dynamo has been built in a way where you could have any amount of different creation environments, any amount of different execution environments, and any amount of different consumption environments to plug and play into it. Currently, we typically just have one or two in most of these scenarios. So in terms of consumption, you can consume inside of Dynamo. You can click play and you can do things inside of it, but you can also use things like Dynamo Player. So what is Dynamo Player? So it's part of this ecosystem. It is part of the consumption ecosystem of Dynamo. And it is, sorry, stay on the same slide, please, Jacob. It is rather than creating content, it allows degrees of customization through things such as inputs. So this means you as a graph author get to control what the consumer gets to touch and change. So the pieces of the puzzle that will flip and move, and the inputs will then choose how that graph will execute downstream. So what this means is that it allows a single creator to positively affect many, many, many different people who are consuming that content, potentially saving thousands and thousands of hours. So if you create like a generic QA/QC script that you're going to run on every single Revit project, and say you work in an office that has thousands of different people working in Revit, that one single script that might have taken you, a handful of hours to make, or even 100 hours to make, is going to save huge amounts of time downstream. And what Player also does is allows you to also hide the inner workings of Dynamo. So if you have colleagues who are scared of the spaghetti, of the nodes and the wires that may scare them off, then Player is a way to circumnavigate that problem and just provide a basic input set for them to play with and navigate to gain the power of that graph itself. Next slide, please. So then a little bit technically about how Player works. So this is the technical stuff. Dynamo Player is embedded inside of Dynamo Revit. It is its own JavaScript UI. And this is what controls Dynamo Player. And then it can fully access, because it's embedded inside of Revit, it can fully access the Revit API and also every single one of Dynamo's DLLs. And so what this means is a few different things. It uses a WebSocket to basically connect this JavaScript UI to the C# API calls. It is currently not connected to the Dynamo UI layer, but it could be in the future. But because it's not currently connected to the Dynamo UI layer, it means you can't really do things with view extensions right now. So for example, Workspace References is not something that's going to propagate up into the Dynamo Player experience. And some other view extensions that things like Dynamaps may not behave appropriately when they come through as well. And what it does, technically speaking, is it executes nodes via available API calls inside of Dynamo, as opposed to the interaction paradigms within the creation space or the IDE space of Dynamo itself. Next slide, please. And so when you want to start sharing content, there's a bunch of different things that come with your Dynamo graph. So what you'll see on the right is a mock-up of work we're actually actively doing right now, which is updating the Workspace References extension. So the top piece of this, the package piece, exists in product today. If you're using, I think, Dynamo 2.5 onwards, or even 2.4 onwards, you'll have some version of this. And what we're going to look to do is actually add the other pieces of the puzzle that might be the missing bits that somebody else who's trying to consume your graph through Dynamo Player is missing. So the content that is loosely sort of bucketed into these three different places. We have packages, which are installable via the Workspace References extension and come from the package manager. We have local definitions. So this is content that somebody has created that lives on their own disk. So this might be custom nodes, like a DYF node that somebody's made, might even be a custom zero touch package, and that lives locally on someone's machine. So that's not existing on the package manager. And then we also have local files, so other things that Dynamo might be talking to. So this might be things like your Revit project, or it might be things like an image file on disk, a JPEG file, or an Excel document, or anything along those lines. And all of these references are things that you as a graph creator have reference to within your graph. And it's what also somebody else who wants to use a graph is going to have to reference as well. So you need to make sure that they have that stuff on their own machine. Next slide, please.
Oh, there's a quick question in chat from Thomas. Will there ever be a list of officially certified packages for every Dynamo version?
I don't know about ever. Ever is a very strong word. We don't currently have that. So currently the information available to us on the package manager is pretty much what you see when you download it. So there's no sort of certification mechanism in play today. We could do that if that is something that the broader community thinks is really important. We could definitely look into it. What we can't do is take ownership of any of the code. So it's incredibly difficult to sort of circumnavigate the gray area between those two spaces. So what we could do is we could take, say, maybe the top 10 or maybe the top 20 most downloaded packages and in essence, do a security review on those every single time they go up, which would be one way to go about it, but we couldn't ever do the entire package manager. That would require a huge amount of effort, hence why the usage of the package manager today is at your own risk. And as we talked about in a previous session, the way to sort of get around that safely right now is to just lean on the community. So if the top 10 or 20 most downloaded packages or highly rated packages, they have basically been vetted by your colleagues and your peers out there in the industry. And they have basically said that this is a good content, please use it.
Cool.
We got a couple other questions as well. We got Brian asking, where would you recommend storing the Dynamo file for all user access?
Jacob, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this one.
I reckon, so it's sort of two different ways to run it. If it's the stuff that's going to be run through Player, I actually recommend robocopying it down to the local disk, which is why I transitioned to this slide, because I know Sol's going to talk about that shortly. For project-specific stuff that's not going to be run through Player, and it's going to be sort of live authoring and sort of figuring stuff out in Dynamo as we go, I'd recommend storing that same place you store other sort of project specific files. Just be careful with stuff being blocked on the network. Shouldn't be an issue for custom nodes as long as they're saved to your local disk. Shouldn't be a problem, but you do need to have read-write access to DYN files in order for them to be able to serialize the element bindings back into the file for those design style graphs.
Yeah. So there's another question in the group, but I think that's to the group around the percentage of usage for player versus authoring. One thing I want to say on that is that from our perspective, we believe that there should be more users of player, more consumers of Dynamo content than there is creators. And we're looking to improve the experience of Dynamo Player as next year rolls around to try and facilitate and help that space. Cool. So onto the topic of robocopy. So robocopy is a sort of innate Windows method of being able to copy content safely. It's I can't remember the acronym stands for, but it's like basically it means safe copy. And so it'll take stuff from a location and copy it to another location with a whole bunch of different optional flags. So what you see on your screen right now is a way to use robocopy to then create a command file, which you can then run through, say, a task scheduler in Windows, and have this run every single time somebody opens Windows and copy content from a central location to other places. So providing the person who runs this has permissions, you can definitely copy these things across a network onto somebody's local disk. And this is a really popular and common way for large scale offices to actually copy content, especially package content, from one place to another. And so the script itself is actually what you see on screen. It's actually really, really easy. All you need to do is have robocopy from one location, so one path, to another path. And then using a bunch of different flags here, it can basically say how many times it wants to try this, if it runs into issues, because if any of those pieces of content are actually in use or loaded into Dynamo or another place, it won't be able to copy them. You know, whether or not you want to create a log file and whether or not you want that log file to be verbose, and also whether or not you want the content to basically match. So if the place you're copying to has additional content that is not existent anymore on the place you're copying from, it can also go and purge and delete that content too. So you can create a one-to-one pairing between a central location managed by an individual or a team, a BIM manager or an IT group, and have that make a consistent experience for all of the users of your Dynamo graph and graph content from one place. And within that frame of mind, you can also do your vetting from a security perspective if you want to. So you can have a centrally managed location to do this kind of stuff. It's very cool. And I would thoroughly recommend, if you're having issues with this, to jump on board and start playing with robocopy. Cool. So one last thing I wanted to touch upon before we hand it over to Dana is user validation. So the Dynamo Player has the ability to do a bunch of different really cool things. And that is the ability to set sort of inputs, run your graph, and then see some outputs. So, you know, you want to change some things, you want to run your graph, you want to see what happens. Then what you could also do potentially is do some intermediate steps inside of this process where Dynamo will execute a portion of the graph. There'll be something that executes within a singular node that basically pauses that execution of that graph. You can make some sort of selection and change, and then continue down the execution tree to keep executing your graph. And you can have as many intermediate pauses as you wish. So one really popular package for this is data shapes, which most of you are probably familiar with. And big shout out to Mustafa Alayubi on this one for his awesome package. And this gives you the option to basically build in custom UI to have these kind of validation or input steps into your graph. So this also works with Dynamo Player and invokes WIN forms inside of Windows via Python inside of these custom nodes too.
All right, I've got one more slide as well before we really hand it over to Dana for the fun stuff. Warning, there's going to be some warnings ahead because nothing is going to run perfect every single time. So plan on users doing, I'm going to say, stupid things with your software as they go, right? If you write a graph that automatically renumbers every single door based on the room that it comes from, right? So we get bedroom 101, bedroom 102, bedroom 103 for all our doors. Someone's going to try and renumber toilets with it. And toilets don't have a from room parameter. They just have a room location parameter, right? And so that's not going to work, right? So either you need to let the user know that, hey, you picked something that doesn't have a from room parameter, try this other graph instead, or you might want to build in some additional sort of error handling that's just going to sort of say, okay, we didn't get anything in the from room parameter, therefore go try this other method of getting the room that it's actually located in. So some back and forth there. Always implement some early QA testing and think through those worst case scenarios, right? Sort of the classic QA joke is, QA engineer walks into a bar, orders a beverage, walks out. QA engineer walks into a bar, orders 2 beverages and walks out. QA engineer walks into a bar, orders a salamander and it broke, writes something down and walks out, right? So it's constantly thinking through what kind of input could you be provided and how will your graph respond to that, right? Once you figure out what ways it will break, figure out how you can call on it so that you can sort of fix it. One thing you can do to sort of prevent the run completed with warnings, go ahead and use a function.apply or a list.map node and pass your data as a function. It is a little bit slower, but it will prevent that run completed with warnings or run completed with errors message that shows up at the bottom of Dynamo or in Dynamo Player. Last chunk here is make sure that you're always exposing these kind of warnings in something that's a little bit more user-friendly than our typical, expected point by coordinates, expected inputs of type double, 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 but was called with string. No, just say, looks like the inputs were incorrect. Maybe give us something that we can actually work with a little bit more common sense wise. Now, these messages can be exposed directly through Dynamo Player, and I know Dana's going to show off a lot of that. You can also leverage data shapes, as Sol mentioned before, or you could just call C-types library in Python and have simple FYIs pop up at any point. But always keep that feedback easy to understand and as free from technical computer speak. Speak the language your users are speaking as opposed to the language that you might be speaking under the hood. And on that note, it's time to hand it over to Dana. I'm going to check the chat while she transitions over to the screen share.
Can we cue the ominous danger music, like the you go down the tunnel in Mario? Like, there you go.
Jaws music came to mind.
Thank you guys. Really great information. I know I'm learning some things. And it's wonderful to see that Autodesk is putting some thought into how we manage all of these things, because I don't like to, right? I don't like to manage all of these things in terms of deployments and where all this stuff lives. And I will say that I have found a lot of success through doing the robocopy down to where Dynamo wants to find things. Put it in the Dynamo default locations. That's what I've had a lot of success with. So with that being said, I do want to show, and you guys can see here, I have a category drop down, which I very, very rarely use. A lot of the time I will do the string and get category by name, just as Jacob showed. But I do want to show, for those of you guys who do have to go back and replace a lot of these things, the category drop downs or other drop downs. Monocle, John Pearson's package, has the drop down converter. So you can literally just click on the node, click on the converter, and it will convert it to design script. So really, really useful. You can see that my output didn't change at all there. So always an applause to John on his amazing tools. So with that being said, I'm going to talk a little bit about Dynamo Player. And I see that you guys within the chat are utilizing Dynamo Player and creating scripts for use within Dynamo Player so that all of your Revit users can use it. And that's so fantastic. I think the more that we can get people inside of Dynamo and using these types of tools to up their productivity and their efficiencies, the more we can hopefully get them into Dynamo one day, right? So, I usually joke that hopefully once somebody starts running Dynamo Player a few times a week, they can start to actually get into the Dynamo script and maybe customize it for their project, right? Not maybe creating the script from scratch, but just being able to get in there and tinker. So I think that hopefully will be that nice bridge. So I am going to run a few scripts for you today. You'll see that I have the sample project, what we're all very familiar with. I've modified it a little bit with some furniture plans and some crops and different things like that, but essentially the same project. You can see here in my Dynamo Player, I have a few Dynamo Player scripts. The first one I'm going to run is annotation crop toggle. And it does exactly what you would think it would do. It's going to toggle the annotation crop, right? This little toggle right here. One thing I like to tell people using Dynamo Player, always get into the habit of clicking edit inputs, because then you know what types of things you have to interface with. So you can see here that I only have one toggle here. Do I want to apply the annotation crop? This will interface with all views. Of course, you could build in logic into the script so that it works with a specific view type or a view group, however you may like. And you can see that it toggled my annotation crop on. Maybe I want to turn it back off, right? And you can see there, I should get a room tag that pops up here somewhere. There it is. So you can see it also displays, once it's run, how many views were updated, as well as what those view names were. So telling the user there specifically what happened. I find that displaying outputs like this is really useful, especially when Jacob was mentioning we have errors within our runs, right? It might run, but run completed with warnings up here. And that's really, really ambiguous to our user, right? Even if it completed what we thought it completed, sometimes I'll still get the call, like, why did it have errors, right? It's like, okay, well, did you check the schedule, or did you go and check the views, or wherever, whatever was supposed to update, did it work, right? So providing outputs like this guarantees that they know it worked, right? Even if it did have errors. The other one I'm going to run today is change case. This actually works with any instance parameter of any category. You can see it's set up to work with sheets and sheet names. And I have a little toggle here, which is actually working in the back end. We'll talk a little bit later. Essentially 0 for lowercase, 1 for title case, and 2 for uppercase. So I'll just toggle that over and run that. And we should see really quick, actually, just only 4 sheets there were moved from original values of lowercase to their new values of uppercase. Maybe you want to go lowercase just because why not? Because I can, and it takes a second, right? And this is the nice thing, is it tells me what the original values were, as you can see, and what the new values were. The last one I'm going to run here before I actually get back into my PowerPoint is areas or rooms. And this is actually just a reporting script. It's just going to report how many and what they are. Right, so I have 91 rooms in my project, and these are their element IDs. If I toggle this to true, you can see that it actually will report my areas for me, and it reports null. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can customize our outputs so that not only do they not say null, but they also maybe tell us more information about the elements themselves. So let's see here. I will get back into my PowerPoint. Do I have any questions? I feel like I saw one come up in the back end. Jacob, do you see them while I'm switching anything for me in there?
There's been some chatting, but not any particular questions.
I'm clicking on the chat button, but my chat window is not coming up. So just let me know if you guys see anything in there.
Will do.
Awesome. So as you can see, there are quite a few input nodes, and this is not all of them. These are just quite a few of the ones that I use on a regular basis. String will, very important to note out that you cannot use a code block as an input. You must use a string. And simply we're going to right click and click is input on any of these nodes. Few things to talk about with inputs, a few tips here. We can provide 2 options, as we saw with our annotation crop toggle, right? I can actually just feed a Boolean right into that value. It's looking for a yes or no, or Boolean, right? And so this case, it's true or false. It's very intuitive to my user to say, do you want your crop or do you not want it cropped, right? And they can run that and it shows up great within Dynamo Player. Sometimes, however, the Boolean isn't necessarily a true or a false, right? We actually want it to be areas or rooms, as this example shows, right? One little trick here, I actually copy the value from a group or a note into the node name, and it will allow for line breaks. You cannot put line breaks in the node name natively. So just copying those line breaks works great. And you can see that I have my Boolean with areas or rooms, true for areas and false for rooms. So once again, making it very clear to my user. It's not on one single line and it doesn't say true or false. It's actually giving a clear indication to the user in terms of how to use this script. So another one here, as we saw with the upper, lower, and title case, you can see that I am actually just creating a list and my number slider is getting that item at the index. So it's actually doing the work for me. the lists are all provided, right? I have my title case, which is a Python script there, and my upper. And the user, by specifying the number, will basically pick the list, right? So the work is really all being done by the get item at index there. So nice little trick, not using data shapes. You could totally use data shapes to get a custom drop down to do this, but just native out of the box nodes here to do that. Moving on to watch nodes. Only watch nodes can be put out as outputs, no other nodes. And they must be renamed and marked as is output. You can't just list them as is output.
So one little case in point with this one, the rename is actually what pulls it through right now, which is a bit of a legacy miss on our part. So apologies, world, Dynamo world, on that one from the Fractal days, Project Fractal days. If you were around in the Dynamo sphere back then, this is going to be improved in the future to actually use as output in this instance. So you can simply use.
Maybe you guys hadn't noticed that, because until yesterday when I was demoing this with Sol and Jacob, I didn't notice it either, that you can actually just rename the node and it will show up in Dynamo Player. So that's what Sol's referring to, is that actually you don't need to actually tell it to be an output. If it's renamed, it will automatically show within Dynamo Player as an output.
The caveat, I believe, is that generative design still requires the is output flag, so be mindful of that. So good habit to do both in this instance, and thank you, Dana, for pointing out that bug yesterday.
And like I said, maybe you guys haven't noticed it, because I only rename watch nodes that I want to show up in Dynamo Player. Usually I'll just name the group, whatever it is that I'm trying to display there for myself within the graph. But great habit to get into, renaming and marking it as is output. That's hard to say. Marking it as is output. Okay. So a few things here that we can do to customize our outputs to make them a little bit more intuitive for our user, right? Because room 177056 doesn't really mean much to me as a user. So what we can do is we can actually report out, in addition to the room, the name and number. And essentially what I've done here is I've just created a list and transposed that list so I get those items together. So the list.create and the list.transpose is what's allowing this list to essentially be visible the way it is. But you can see here, in addition to the 177056 room, it also tells the user that it's the vestibule and room number 101, right? So it gives them more information in terms of the room that's in their project. Another thing that we can do is we can essentially, as Jacob was mentioning, if that script isn't being utilized right, the example that he used was the 2-room parameter, right? If your stair doesn't have 2 room or whatever it might be, right? In this case, I'm actually telling the script here to basically say no elements were found, right? So that essentially when the user runs a script for, in this case, areas, right, it actually says no elements found rather than null, right? Because null is, until I used Dynamo, I didn't even know what null was, right, in terms of code. So very important to try to give those little breadcrumbs to your user. And of course, it's helpful for me because that means that I get less calls at the end of the day, right? Another little tidbit here, and this is a nice little trick that I actually am going to not run through in Dynamo, but give you guys the breadcrumbs here and be happy to share this script with anybody who wants it. You can see here that my user probably had caps lock on, right? And when they typed in the node name or the parameter name and the value that they want to update, in this case, this will update a parameter value to be found and replaced, right? So in this case, they're trying to update the author on the drawn by parameter to be whatever it is that their name is, right? I just put an XXX, but you can see that they have the D and the B as lowercase and the rest all is uppercase, right? And we know that that's not how drawn by is spelled, right? It doesn't look like that at all. So the output says no element updated. and check to ensure that the parameter/parameter value exists as specified, case specific. So, right, so they can then say, okay, nothing happened. Let me look back up at the inputs there, and they can say, oh, okay, yep, I typed that in correctly. They can type it in the way that it should be put in there, right? With the capital D and the capital B, run it, and hopefully everything will run fine. Once again, cutting down on the amount of calls that I'm going to get at the end of the day. So that is the part of the presentation I have. I'm going to stop so I can actually see the chat here if I'm missing anything, and let you guys move on. Doesn't look like.
And of course, I'm on mute, so I'm frantically scrambling to find my microphone button. I'll take back over the screen share. Yeah, chat. Nothing in chat at the moment. There were a couple things around. I think it was Thomas was looking for, and I get this a few times, and I finally just posted it up to the Dynamo forum. A desire for a number slider that has an input for the minimum and an input for the maximum, and then it allows number sliding. I posted a link to the chat to a Dynamo forum post that basically uses parameterization of the two different values. So if you're all the way down at 0, it's going to give you the first value. If you're all the way up at 1, it's going to give you the last value. And anywhere in between on your integer slider or number slider, it's going to give you a percentage between those two values. Eventually, hopefully, we'll have a better input for that. But yeah, that's that.
Awesome.
Great presentation, Dana. I always love watching the stuff that you do with Player. It's even just that copy paste of the multi-lines, like, wish I'd thought of that.
Game changer.
Well, and it's just in using it, right? Even how we figured out that the watch node was coming out in Dynamo Player without being checked as an input. It was because I was preparing for this presentation, right? It's like just playing with it and customizing it. I will say it is hard, as Jacob was mentioning, how do we test those bugs? As you work through Dynamo, you will start to kind of have a basis of what some of those bugs are and plan for them. But it's always really nice when a user will run the script within their project and I'll get some crazy data out of it, right? That I just was not expecting at all. Maybe they use a in-place component or something that's skewing my data or whatever it might be. But those are really, really great to find, those little Easter eggs, or if you will, of API nuggets.
For sure. I would also like to echo that and say the most I've ever learned about anything in my life is when I actually present on it too. So you find these intricacies, these tips, these tricks, these fun things when you have to talk about it to somebody else.
Absolutely. One of the last Dynamo scripts that I was updating, I actually added additional functionality to it. It was something I worked with Jacob quite a bit on, some of the material stuff at Smith Group. And I realized, like, man, this script would be awesome if I could update the material location when I ran this script. And it was totally because I was putting a data set together to teach how to use this script. And I was like, man, that sucks that I have to go back and update the location after the fact. Like, we should just do it all in this run, right? And I almost get kind of upset with the interior designers or whoever's running the scripts. Like, why don't you tell me that this sucks? Like, it can be better. Like, let's make it better, right? So just even using the tools, sometimes by myself, I'll realize that additional functionality would be useful. So.
All right. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Jacob and Sol. Do you want to address our hiatus, Jacob?
I'll let Sol take this one. Typically his
friend. Cool. So thank you everyone for joining us to date in the Dynamo office hours. We're going to have a break for August. So for the entirety of the next month, we're going to skip those 2 projected sessions. This just gives a little bit of a break for everybody here on the call, a little bit of breathing room. And we're going to come back and return in September. So the session that will come first up in September is design scripting all the things. So we're going to deep dive into DesignScript and show you a bunch of really cool things of what you can do with DesignScript. And then we're going to have a little lighter session when it comes to the last one of September, which is just going to preview some AU sessions of note. So focused on Dynamo and the derivatives of Dynamo, of things that build on top of Dynamo, such as generative design and so on. We're just going to cover that. It's going to be a little bit more lighthearted. It's going to be more conversational, and we'd love to hear your feedback sort of in tandem on that one too. And then there is more to come as well as we tail out the end of the year. We have a series of sessions running up to basically the end of the year, and we're going to look to get a bit more specific next year when it comes to getting into some host operations, potentially some deep dives into some more of the techniques of how Dynamo works. The series to date has really been like a gentle introduction to concepts, key concepts, and core things that you need to know to find success with Dynamo, even though I'm sure if you're a Dynamo wizard, you've come along and hung out with us, you might have learned one or two things as well along the way, and hope that you did. But lots more cool content to come. Watch this space, and please do join us back on September the 9th.
Thank you, Sol. And there's a lot of accolades for the presenters here on the sessions. And then Thomas, poor Thomas has to go without using Revit for 3 weeks. Boo. Anyway, thank you, everybody. We'll wrap up today's session with 2 final slides. Kate posted some links. If you're looking for other ways to connect and engage with the Autodesk community, we have a few resources for you, and they're great ones. You can explore the various Autodesk communities, including the global network of user groups in the Autodesk Group Network, our industry-focused communities helping your colleagues solve business challenges together, the Autodesk forums, of course, and staying connected with us on Twitter. So thank you very much for attending. And we look forward to seeing you in September. So everybody have a really safe August.
See you, everyone.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for
Thank
coming,
you,
Dana.
Dana.